Welcome to Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. I'm your host, Nicole Davenport. It was October 12th, 2019, on the dusty stretch of Syria's M4 motorway, pretty much the only lifeline running across northern Rojava, which is located in northeast Syria. Hevrin Khalaf was riding in the back of a bulletproof SUV. She was 34, a civil engineer by training, a revolutionary by choice. She wasn't carrying a weapon. Well, not in the literal sense, though she did carry with her the weapon of diplomacy at all times, building bridges between Kurds, Arabs, Syriacs, and Christians in the fragile framework of a democratic project that terrified those in power and delighted feminists alike. The road ahead looked calm. Her focus, as always, was on the road forward, in both senses of that phrase. For diplomacy, for peace, for the women who would lead it, and also on this usually empty road that runs a bit too close for comfort to Turkey, who have hatefully murdered and suppressed Kurdish people since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The very road that her vehicle was traveling on at that very moment. Then suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, quickly gaining on Hevrin's vehicle, dust storming up in rooster tails from the spinning tires. Without warning, a convoy of Turkish-backed Ahrar al-Sharqiya fighters ambushed the vehicle. The driver was shot first. The front windows shattered on impact, but the bullets didn't reach her. The back windows held, bulletproof, but the men came anyway. They forced the doors open. They dragged her from the safety she had built, not just in that vehicle, but in the fragile alliances, the new political vision she had dared to champion within the Future of Syria party. On video, she can be heard telling the loud, invasive, violent men that she was the leader of the party. She was the Secretary General of the party, to be exact. They wanted to make a point. So they dragged her out of the car by her hair and viciously assaulted her. And then they executed her. They brazenly filmed her mutilated body. They spit. They jeered. They called her a pig. This happened shortly after American troops just up and pulled troops out. Not a huge surprise considering what has seemingly been on his bingo card for 2025. Hevrin Khalaf was not just a politician. She was a woman who stood between a wide array of different types of patriarchal entities and democracy. A woman who rose unapologetically Kurdish and fiercely feminist to build peace in a region shabbily designed for ruin by the greedy, indifferent colonizers. She was a Kurd who wanted to rebuild Syria as a democracy, and that made her dangerous in the eyes of those residing in the surrounding nation-states. This is the story of what she and millions of other Kurdish folks alike stood for. A revolution sparked in the mountains, shaped in prison, and carried forward by women and men who would rather die than go back to the oppression that they had faced all of their lives. The Rojava revolution is not only Kurdish, it is feminist, it is communal, and it is constantly under threat. And while the current state of the United States is devolving, thanks to that very guy who recklessly pulled troops out of Syria, Rojava continues to evolve by means of the very women who were able to survive and push forward with this revolution. As per the usual, show notes can be found on Spotify and on Podbean. This podcast supports the Red Crescent organization. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is the world's largest humanitarian network. The movement is neutral and impartial, and it also provides protection and assistance to people affected by disasters and conflicts. Content warning: discussions about war crimes, SA, and trafficking. Use caution when and where you listen. Colonialism. It never just redraws existing borders of countries. It also rewrites the roles for the people residing in those countries. In the case of the Kurdish people, though, colonialism wrote them out, as if they were altogether just cancelled. Under the Ottomans, the Kurds were sometimes privileged, sometimes punished, but they were allowed to exist. That changed with the rise of nation-states. In the wake of the Ottoman Empire's collapse, European powers carved up the region like a turkey on Thanksgiving. Or a butcher even, if you're not feeling the American reference. They then decided which lucky group of people would get its very own nation-state. European nation-state models demanded centralized rule, top-down power, militarized masculinity, and subservient femininity. And in suppressing the Kurds, colonial and nationalist regimes came down on Kurdish women the hardest. Their power, their roles, their autonomy, all gone. It is important to remember that the Kurdish people are a monolithic people. There are between 30 and 45 million Kurdish people worldwide. We're going to focus on how a feminist movement called the Rojava Revolution in Kurdistan grew from such an extreme place of oppression and evolved into what it is today. So here comes a short history lesson for you all. I know you're excited. While most of the story I tell today will focus mostly on the area of northern Syria and southern Turkey, which are parts of Kurdistan, the overall story I'm telling is that of the Kurdish people, starting with the beginnings of their repression and also the repression of other ethnic minorities in that region. In 1916, right in the middle of World War I, the very secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between the United Kingdom and France, with assent from Russia and Italy, divided up the Middle East into British and French zones of influence and divided out the borders of the modern Middle East. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was defeated and collapsing. The Allied powers, Britain, France, Italy, you get it, began dividing up the region, as I just said. They created the Treaty of Sèvres, and there was this special little section for the Kurds. Articles 62 through 64 of the treaty proposed the possibility of an independent Kurdish state in what is now eastern Turkey. The idea was that the Kurds would be allowed a referendum to determine if they wanted independence. I guess it sounded good to keep the peace a while longer. Like when a parent tells a kid, maybe later. The reality is, though, that it was never implemented. Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk rejected the treaty and launched a war for their own independence. On July 24, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, and it replaced the Treaty of Sèvres. This was the result of the War of Independence for Turkey. Now, what this treaty did was it recognized Turkey's wishes for its new borders, which are the very same of the present day, but made no mentions of a Kurdish state. And just like that, Kurdish autonomy was erased, and Kurds were divided between Turkey, Iraq under British rule, Syria under French rule, and Iran. The promise of a homeland was gone. Kurds became minorities in these countries, facing decades of repression, forced assimilation, and denial of their entire identity. In 1924, the Turkish government banned Kurdish schools, organizations, and publications. Even the words Kurd and Kurdistan were outlawed, effectively criminalizing Kurdish identity. The vision of the very first president of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was that of modernity and uniformity. The so-called quote-unquote Turkification process that Kurds were automatically expected to adopt into their lives meant that the Kurdish language and even culture were banned and criminalized. They were referred to as quote-unquote mountain Turks, which is kind of like saying Kurds. There are no Kurds. They're all Turks. Kurdish uprisings like the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925 were completely crushed. In Iraq, Syria, and Iran, similar programs of erasure unfolded. Kurdish identity was viewed as a threat to national unity. Each regime with its own flavor of oppression, all rooted in the same nationalistic type of script: strip people of land, silence the women, and call it unity. But what doesn't get talked about enough is that this wasn't just about ethnicity. It was about order, about hierarchy, and that hierarchy always starts with gender. Because as colonialism imposed new borders, it reimposed patriarchy. To be Kurdish, a woman once said, is to learn silence before you learn to speak. And she wasn't wrong, because by the 1930s, just years after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, silence of the Kurds had become a part of the scenery. In 1930, the Ari Rebellion, one of the first large Kurdish uprisings in the new Turkish Republic, was defeated with brutality. Thousands were killed. The Turkish government enacted the resettlement law in 1934, aiming to assimilate non-Turkish populations by forcibly relocating them. This policy targeted Kurdish regions, disrupting communities and further eroding cultural practices. The Dersim massacre of 1937-38 resulted in the deaths of thousands of Kurds, with many women and children among the victims. This campaign aimed to suppress Kurdish resistance and enforce assimilation. A short-lived, independently governed state in Kurd-inhabited territories of Iran that came under Soviet control during World War II were established by the Kurds, which they called the Republic of Mahabad. But unfortunately, Iran reoccupied Mahabad after the Soviet withdrawal in December 1946. And just a couple years later, on April 4th, 1948, Abdullah Öcalan was born. And he will be incredibly important to the establishment of Rojava, the autonomous region in north and east Syria. He would also be labeled a terrorist due to certain factors. He would be the oldest of 7 children, living in a poor village in southeastern Turkey. His family were seasonal laborers, ethnically Kurdish, but taught to hide it. Anikam Nachvani, lecturer at the Barlan University, has relayed that when they met in 1990, Öcalan did not speak Kurdish, which indicates that his family didn't dare teach him Kurdish as a child, even though they knew it, of course. Even as a boy, Öcalan felt the sting of nationalism. He reportedly expressed that he could not even speak Kurdish in his dreams, which highlights just how profoundly cultural suppression under the Turkish state impacted Kurdish identity. But in school, he began to rise. A quiet student at first, shy even, he would later come to be known as the peasant boy from Turkey who started a revolution. In the early 1960s, the Middle East was a tapestry of shifting borders and shifting identities. In 1962, the Syrian government conducted a census in the Al-Hasaka governorate, resulting in approximately 120,000 Kurds being stripped of their citizenship. This action rendered them stateless denying them fundamental rights such as voting, property ownership, and legal recognition of marriages. The government's justification was that these Kurds were recent immigrants who couldn't prove residence in Syria before 1945. Meanwhile, Abdullah Öcalan was a young man in Turkey beginning his political journey. But then came 1968. Student uprisings, anti-imperialism, Marxism, they were all on the rise. He was involved in anti-communist circles and simultaneously in leftist circles, taking in what he needed to begin to form his first ideas for full Kurdish independence with hopes. Well, not exactly hopes, but demands for an independent Kurdistan. A real one this time. Anyway, across the globe, revolutions were beginning to be televised, and Öcalan was taking notes. By the early 1970s, he was a university student in Ankara, in Turkey. It was there, while studying political science, that he began to organize for Kurdish rights, for a total upheaval of the system, class, race, gender, all of it. And though feminism wasn't yet central to his ideology, the seeds were there, because he saw how patriarchy held Kurdish women down just as violently as the Turkish state held Kurds down. And he would later say, "A country can't be free unless its women are free." Just for reference of what was happening during that time to the Kurds over in Iraq, a sneaky betrayal was John Hancocked behind closed doors in 1975, which crushed the heart of an entire rebellion involving the Kurds living there. In Algiers, Saddam Hussein struck a deal with Iran's Shah. He handed over sovereignty of half of the Shatt al-Arab waterway, a vital and contested estuary, in exchange for one thing: that Iran would stop backing the Kurdish fighters who had long been resisting Baghdad's regime. The Shah agreed, and the United States, ever the loyal arms dealer when it serves their allies, immediately pulled the plug on their secret support for the Kurdish rebellion. Don't forget, though, that it was support that they had only given because Iran asked for it. What followed was devastating. Cut off and outmaneuvered, the Kurdish resistance in Iraq collapsed almost overnight. Thousands were forced to flee, families were torn apart. Saddam's regime reclaimed control with a vengeance, and the world barely batted an eye. Meanwhile, what began as a small group of Marxist-Leninist militants in Turkey calling for Kurdish autonomy in 1974 would become one of the most controversial armed resistance movements in the Middle East. And in 1978, Öcalan gave it a name: the Kurdistan Workers' Party, aka the PKK. Now, this section is going to name a lot of different acronyms, and I'll try to make it as easy as possible to understand. And it is women that would be central to its rebirth later on down the line. But first, the road toward the Rojava Revolution. So I watched a video of Öcalan speaking. He perfectly blends charisma, political theory, and cultural resonance into his leadership. In the video, the journalist and the small militant group, the PKK, are sitting down to eat. The journalist asks a woman about her relationship with Öcalan, if she loved him. Öcalan looks a bit astonished over this, going so far as to ask, "This is the question you ask me, if she loves me?" It also speaks to how easily revolutionary movements get flattened in the media. A woman with a rifle becomes the girl who loves the leader, rather than someone with deep political and existential convictions. Öcalan interrupting that, to me, showed a bit of his character. Whether or not someone agrees with his ideology, there's no denying the sharpness of his mind and the emotional intelligence he seems to wield especially later on. Anyway, he went on to say something that I find interesting. He said, quote, "The people in this religion are used to listening to prophets. That is how people here engage and learn. So I have to speak to them like a prophet because that is what they understand." I mean, what do you guys think? Is it a little bit culty? Maybe, but the thing about their doctrine is that it wasn't fixed. It was meant to evolve further and further because isn't that the way it should be? To learn and adapt as you go? Or should we go on doing the same things without results, as so much of the world is doing as we speak? But anyway, it worked. The man knew his audience. He was trying to uproot generations of silence and obedience, explaining in an interview that he wished to teach women to be completely independent from men and to be able to decide over their own lives. Human rights. Something that so many of us take for granted. In 1977, Öcalan and two comrades wrote a manifesto which was called The National Road to the Kurdish Revolution, and it is this document that would become the blueprint for the PKK, the beginning. Now, at first, the PKK was not taken seriously at all, being referred to basically as a ragtag group of bandits by Turkey. But the group grew and grew, attracting Kurds who were feeling completely disenfranchised. They were initially advocating for an independent Kurdish state. In 1980, in Turkey, following a military coup d'etat, the use of the Kurdish language was officially prohibited in both public and private life. Martial law would go on effect for the next 3 years in Turkey. Speaking, publishing, or singing in Kurdish could lead to arrest and imprisonment. The PKK party seemed to understand that it was about time to hit the road at that point, taking the next 4 years to move the operation into northern Syria, to restructure and rebuild. A little while after the coup d'etat, the Diyarbakir prison became packed with Kurds for the offense of, wait for it, being Kurdish. This hellhole was infamous even by dictatorship standards. Kurdish inmates were forced to eat rats, lick toilets, and even repeat the words, "I am a Turk." That was the tipping point. By 1984, the PKK had shifted from low-level urban skirmishes to full-scale armed struggle. It launched its first major attacks in the southeastern province of Sirt and Hakkari. Ambushes, raids, and sabotage. Suddenly, the Turkish state was dealing not with students and slogans protesting for rights, but with trained guerrilla fighters armed and ready to reclaim what had been denied for generations. The fight escalated. Turkey responded with brutal force, burning villages, deploying thousands of troops, and disappearing activists. But the PKK was gaining ground, territorially and also ideologically. They were building an alternative. PKK training camps emerged across the region, in the Kandil Mountains, in the Bekaa Valley, with Syrian tolerance, of course, even deep inside Turkish and Iraqi terrain. And alongside military drills, something else was happening. The Rojava revolution was taking shape, and women were stepping into the role of revolutionaries, not just as fighters, but as theorists and as leaders. And over time, Öcalan's theory evolved. After years of struggle, exile, and armed resistance, he started to write not only about the Kurdish cause, but about women. Öcalan famously declared that, quote, "The first colony is the woman," end quote, in his Freedom Manifesto for Women, written while imprisoned years later. He would argue that all other systems of oppression, capitalism, nationalism, colonialism, are built on the original act of enslaving women. He wrote that patriarchy is the prototype of all tyranny, that without freeing women, no revolution could ever be complete. This ideology was starting to reshape the PKK. Female fighters were no longer behind the men, they were leading beside them, creating their own command structures and training in feminist theory alongside military tactics. Women began organizing their own units and questioning their roles, not just in war, but in society. The women were rewriting warfare in that region. By the mid-1990s, the PKK had begun to institutionalize this shift. Co-leadership, mandating that every position of power be shared between a man and a woman, became not only a policy, but a revolutionary principle. Women's academies were established within the movement, and as the PKK dug into the Kandil Mountains of northern Iraq, after being expelled from Syria, this ideological shift only deepened. Guerrilla warfare was still on the agenda, but now dismantling the patriarchy was too. By the late 90s, Turkey was growing more aggressive in its pursuit of Öcalan. International pressures mounted. Syria, once his reluctant host, was forced to expel him. What followed was a global game of political hot potato. Greece, Russia, Italy, each refused to shelter him long term. In October 1998, after immense pressure from Turkey, including threats of military action, Syria expelled Abdullah Öcalan, who had been living in exile there for years. Öcalan fled first to Russia, but that was quickly pushed out due to international pressure. Then, on November 12, 1998, he arrived in Italy, seeking political asylum. Italy, under its democratic and legal obligations, refused to extradite him to Turkey, which still had the death penalty at the time, but also didn't want to grant him asylum, fearing backlash from NATO allies, particularly the United States and Germany, who were aligned with Turkey at that time. And still. While in Italy, Öcalan was held under house arrest near Rome. Massimo D'Alema was the prime minister during that time. He said, quote, "The operation to take Mr. Öcalan out of the villa he was staying in was somewhat adventurous," end quote. He recalled also that, quote, "We had found someone who resembled him, and this person took his place. At the time agreed, Mr. Öcalan left dressed as a policeman during a short guard change and disappeared without anyone noticing," end quote. Public opinion was divided. Some on the European left, including feminists and anti-imperialistic circles, saw Öcalan as a revolutionary voice for stateless people and especially women. Meanwhile, Turkey waged a heavy diplomatic offense, accusing Italy of harboring a terrorist. Öcalan's time in Italy turned into a legal and diplomatic limbo. No European country was willing to give him asylum, and extraditing him to a country with capital punishment would have violated European human rights conventions, like the Geneva Convention. By January 1999, the situation became untenable. Italy essentially had to force Öcalan to leave without resolving his asylum status. Eventually, in February 1999, Turkish intelligence agents captured him in a Greece embassy in Kenya with help from the CIA and Mossad and flew him back to Turkey. After Öcalan's capture in 1999, many might have assumed the Kurdish liberation struggle would wither without its charismatic leader. But something else happened. From inside a Turkish prison cell on Emrali Island, where Öcalan was held, he began transforming. His prison became his monastery. His ideology evolved with him. Gone was the hardline Marxist-Leninist dream of an independent Kurdish state. In its place, Öcalan proposed something far more dangerous to those who were comfy in their nation-state power: democratic confederalism. The fascinating After Öcalan's capture in 1999, many might have assumed the Kurdish liberation struggle would wither without its charismatic leader. But something else happened. From inside a Turkish prison cell on Emirali Island, Öcalan began his transformation. His prison became like a monastery to him, and his ideology evolved. Gone was that hardline Marxist-Leninist dream of an independent Kurdish state, and in its place, Öcalan proposed something far more dangerous to those who were all comfy in their nation-state power: democratic confederalism. The fascinating concept of a stateless, anti-capitalist, feminist form of radical democracy that rejected domination from any state, including a Kurdish one. And at the center of this new vision? Women. The emphasis being on genealogy, the study of women. In his Freedom Manifesto for Women and later prison writings, Öcalan argued that all systems of slavery are rooted in the housewifization of women, that the original colonization was not land or race, but womanhood itself, furthering his original thoughts and ideas about a woman's role in society, and how, in his eyes, no revolution could succeed unless women were freed first. It was a theory they'd have to test on the battlefield. Out of the ruins of the Syrian civil war in 2012, Kurdish majority regions would eventually declare the Democratic Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, aka Rojava. What emerged was a rare experiment in stateless governance, where women could fight in the revolution and even lead it. The YPJ, the Women's Protection Units, formed in 2013 alongside their male counterparts, the YPG. This wasn't tokenism either. These women were tacticians, snipers, base commanders, and philosophers. Many of them were teenagers. Many had been child brides, but some had lost entire families to ISIS, and many joined not just to fight, but to unlearn what had been done to them. At the heart of Rojava's governance was co-leadership. Every position of political power had to be held by one man and one woman. Women's councils formed in every village. Genealogy, as we have previously touched on, Öcalan's Science of Women, was taught in academies. Patriarchy was discussed, dissected, and countered. With Öcalan cut from the outside world, it was the feminists of Rojava that carried his ideas forward, but also shaped them into their own. They had inherited the revolution and they rebuilt it daily, often with rifles slung over their shoulders. Now, bear with me while I explain something to you like you're 5. Now, let's say there's a school where the same kids always get picked on to be class president. They're usually boys, usually loud, and they never let anyone else talk. The girls are told to help, not lead, and if they show even the slightest resistance, they're told to sit down and be quiet. Now, imagine one day some of the students say, what if we made a new school? What if everyone got a say, and every president had to share power with their counterpart, a girl? That's kind of what happened in Rojava, the region in northeast Syria that I've been leading up to. Now, when the Arab Spring started in 2011, people all over the Middle East stood up and said, hey, we deserve better. In Syria, this turned into a long, ugly civil war. The government was cracking down and chaos was everywhere. But in the middle of that chaos, the Kurdish people, especially in the north, decided not to wait around for someone else to save them. They started organizing. I mean, they didn't want kings, they didn't want dictators, they didn't want some army in charge. They wanted democracy, the kind of power that is shared equally, especially amongst women. That's where Abdullah Öcalan comes back in. If you recall, last we left off with Öcalan, he was exiled to that dreaded Imali Island as the sole prisoner for many, many years, under the guard of an alleged 1,000 men. Also, he'd been writing about what he called democratic confederalism, a way of organizing life where decisions are made locally by councils, and where patriarchy, the system that puts men above women, is dismantled. Öcalan, as you recall, believed that all systems of oppression began with the oppression of women. He had said, quote, "The oldest form of slavery is the enslavement of women. Housewifization is not a biological destiny, it's a political one." And the people of Rojava, they listened. They created a system where every political position had co-leaders, one man and one woman. Every village had women's councils with real power. Every part of society had to answer the question, is this liberating women or keeping them down? The girls voted. They trained as fighters. Many joined the YPJ, the Women's Defense Units, standing beside their brothers in the YPG to defend their land, their people, and their freedom to be equal. This was a revolution where freedom wasn't measured in land or flags. It was measured by how free the women were. And I can't help but think of keeping up with the Joneses, but trying to outdo each other's levels of feminism. And that's the world they were building, right there in the midst of a huge civil war. Next, we'll head to Sinjar, just over in northern Iraq, where the girls of Rojava would meet one of their biggest tests yet. It all started in 2011, when peaceful protests broke out in Syria, inspired by the Arab Spring I spoke about earlier. These were uprisings that took place in places like Tunisia and Egypt. Syrians took to the streets to demand democracy, freedom, and an end to the brutal dictatorship of President Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. But instead of listening, Assad did the old double down. He used violence, arrests, and even chemical weapons on his own people. The protests turned into an armed uprising, and then a full-blown civil war. As the war dragged on, Syria fractured under the extreme pressure. Rebel groups controlled some areas. Assad's forces held others, and the chaos left wide open spaces with no real government rule or law. That's when extremist groups like ISIS and al-Nusra saw their chance. During the chaos of Syria's civil war, extremist groups scrambled to seize control, but not all of them used the same playbook. ISIS, as we know, was brutal and unapologetically immediate. Wherever they went, they slammed down Sharia law like a hammer. No waiting, no consent, just domination. It was fear first, questions never. But Jabhat al-Nusra, Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, had a more insidious approach. They watched ISIS with distaste, not because they opposed the violence, no, but because they thought ISIS moved too fast, too reckless. To al-Nusra, extremism should be like a slow, secured process. Win the hearts, twist the minds, and only then pull the rug out from under the people. It was all about timing, indoctrination first, enforce Sharia law later. Cults that do slow indoctrination seem to fare the best and have the most damaging impact. This sentiment will be extremely relevant later on in the story due to al-Nusra's leader becoming the transitional president of Syria. Anyway, by 2014, ISIS had swept across Syria and Iraq, seizing cities, oil fields, and declaring a caliphate from Raqqa. Interesting thing about the word caliphate. In Sweden, we had a show called Kalifat, which was about a case of two girls who were lured into the so-called caliphate. It also showed how ISIS hijacked the word from what was typically known to be just an area or region ruled by one prophet. They redefined the word, which is pretty culty if you ask me, to mean an ideal place where everything is beautiful and pure and one, so they could easier recruit young people, of course. The Syrian civil war created the perfect storm for groups like ISIS to rise, and the people who suffered the most were often those already on the margins: ethnic and religious minorities, women, and children. By mid-2014, the Islamic State had carved out a violent swath of territory across Syria and Iraq. Their ideology was rooted in extreme patriarchal control, and they made it clear: women were to be owned and traded. On August 3rd, 2014, ISIS stormed Sinjar in Iraq, home to the Yazidi community, a historically persecuted ethnic and religious minority. When ISIS arrived, they massacred an estimated 5,000 Yazidi men and older boys, dumping bodies into mass graves. Over 6,000 women and girls were abducted, many as young as 9 years old, and sold into slavery. Survivor Nadia Murad, who later won the Nobel Peace Prize, was just 21 years old when ISIS fighters killed her mother and 6 of her brothers. She was taken to Mosul, where she was sold into sexual slavery. She later said, quote, "They treated us less than human. They essayed us, they sold us, they broke our bodies, and they tried to break our souls." Many Yazidi women were subjected to systematic SA, forced conversions, and beatings. Some took self-exit rather than be violated again. When the Iraqi Kurdish forces, the Peshmerga, who have been known to somehow have relations with Turkey, which many see as traitorous, especially Öcalan and the PKK forces, well, they withdrew from Sinjar just before the attack on thousands of Yazidis, and they were left trapped and had to run up the mountains with no food, no water, no shelter in 50-degree Celsius heat. But Öcalan's PKK, which had co-leadership, the all-male YPG and the all-women YPJ, responded. They created a corridor through the mountains, helping an estimated 35,000 Yazidis escape. The PKK fighters fought back ISIS units with guerrilla tactics honed over decades, while the YPJ became global symbols of resistance, not just for their bravery, but for what they stood for: a world where women would never again be reduced to property. The rescue efforts continued for months. Some Yazidi girls were reunited with families. Others joined the fight. A number of survivors later helped form the Yazidi Women's Units, YJS, a militia formed by and for Yazidi women, some of whom had escaped ISIS captivity and chose to fight back. Now let's move on to Raqqa, the capital of the so-called caliphate, and the place where feminist resistance met ISIS head-on. By 2014, Raqqa became the de facto capital of ISIS, a brutal stronghold where extremist rule was enforced with savagery. Under their control, women were forbidden from walking alone, forced into black niqabs, and banned from schools and work. Punishments were public, thinking like Gilead vibes here. Executions were filmed. The city was hollowed out by fear. Women and girls were traded and sold here as well. I saw a video where two women filmed what was happening within this apocalyptic nightmare. It was really like watching a horror film. But in 2017, after years of preparation and coalition-backed coordination, the Syrian Democratic Forces, a Kurdish-led alliance that included the YPG and the all-women YPJ, launched the Raqqa campaign. It was one of the most intense and dangerous battles of the Syrian civil war. Over the course of 4 months, street by street, the SDF pushed forward. The women of the YPJ fought side by side with their male counterparts, not just against ISIS, but against the ideology that it fueled, an ideology that had systematically erased women. Many of these fighters had grown up under the influence of Öcalan's prison writings, which recentered the struggle for freedom around dismantling patriarchy. In 2017, Raqqa fell. What remained was devastation, though. Nearly 80% of the city was uninhabitable. But there was something. A void, where ISIS once ruled, now held space for a new kind of vision. One in which women who had once been enslaved, silenced, or kept from their own future could now shape the next one. And while most of the world turned the page, exhausted by the news cycle, the women of Rojava didn't. They stayed. They helped rebuild. They supported families returning to ruins. And they continued organizing councils and cooperatives rooted in the same feminist, ecological, and democratic ideals they had fought for with rifles in hand. When ISIS had declared Raqqa the capital of its so-called caliphate, the world watched in horror as it became a center for executions, slavery, and extreme gender violence. But what the world also saw, and perhaps for the first time, was a new kind of resistance. Women with Kalashnikovs standing shoulder to shoulder with their male counterparts, fighting not just to survive, but for equality also. Now, it was the YPG and the YPJ operating within the broader Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, and led the charge to liberate Raqqa in 2017, as we just discussed. These women were symbols that terrified ISIS, quite literally too. Some ISIS militants believed that being killed by a woman would rob them of their promised reward in the afterlife. And the YPJ leaned into that fear, some laughing about it, some seeming to thrive off of it. By March 2019, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, with the Kurdish-led YPG, the People's Protection Units, and the YPJ, the Women's Protection Units, I'm just giving you guys a little refresher here, at the forefront, launched the final assault on Baghouz, the last territorial stronghold of ISIS in Syria. After weeks of intense fighting, the SDF declared victory, officially marking the end of ISIS's self-declared caliphate. This battle was militarily significant and also ideologically symbolic. The defeat of one of the most violently patriarchal and misogynistic regimes in recent history was carried out in large part by an army that embraced gender equality as a core principle. The YPJ, made up entirely of women, stood shoulder to shoulder with male fighters in one of the most decisive victories against jihadist terror in the 21st century. This marked a military achievement. It also underscored the strength of inclusive grassroots defense force, where women are allowed to fight and to lead. Their success was built on the shared belief that true strength lies in equality. With Raqqa liberated, the next tragic event became political. Enter Hevrin Kalaf, a 35-year-old Kurdish Syrian civil engineer turned political visionary. As Secretary General of the future Syria Party, she worked to build peace across ethnic and sectarian lines, promoting a model of grassroots democracy that reflected Rojava's radical experiment in gender equality and autonomy. But peace in this region would be very hard to come by. In October 2019, under orders from President Trump, U.S. forces abruptly withdrew from the northern Syria area, effectively abandoning their Kurdish allies who had led the ground fight against ISIS. That sudden vacuum gave way to Operation Peace Spring, which Hevrin Kalaf rightfully, in my opinion, called occupation of Turkey. Turkey's military incursion into northeastern Syria, under the guise of establishing a quote-unquote safe zone. In reality, it was an assault on the framework of democratic confederalism that Rojava had been built on, especially on the Kurdish-led forces, women's leadership, and pluralistic governance Turkey deemed threatening. But also, Turkey seems to convict anyone speaking Kurdish as being in cahoots with the PKK. That's the only defense that man seems to come up with. But being that NATO doesn't seem to give a damn about Turkey's war crimes, Turkey continues to get away with assaults on civilians, claiming always that they are PKK affiliates. It was in the immediate aftermath of this betrayal that Hevrin Kalaf was assassinated, a chilling act carried out by Turkish-backed militias emboldened by the withdrawal of the U.S. protection. Her death symbolized something significant, the attempt to destroy a political project that dared to put women at the center of power in a region long shaped by patriarchal violence. In 2019, following the assassination of Kalaf, the Syrian landscape remained volatile. The Assad regime, backed by Russia and Iran, continued to regain territory elsewhere in Syria, often through brutal airstrikes and sieges. Yet in northern Syria, Rojava persisted. Despite territorial setbacks and geopolitical betrayals, including the 2019 withdrawal of U.S. troops from key border zones, the autonomous administration held firm. Estimates vary, but by 2020, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, had grown to around 80,000 fighters, with tens of thousands within the YPG and the YPJ alone. And these were teachers and farmers and mothers and daughters. The YPJ wasn't an auxiliary force. It was a command structure, a vision, a rebuke to both ISIS's vision of womanhood and the world's indifference to it. From 2020 to the present, the Syrian landscape has undergone significant transformations. In December 2024, after over 5 decades of Assad family rule, Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia as rebel forces seized control of Damascus, marking the end of his regime. This happened thanks to all of the rebel forces, who all did it for their own reasons. The swift collapse of the Assad government led to the emergence of a transitional administration headed by none other than Ahmad al-Sharaa. Oh yeah, you guys may remember this guy from Jabhat al-Nusra, and then later the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. HTS is the acronym for that one. He seems to have quite the resume. Al-Sharaa has since presented a new constitution and positioned himself as a proponent of democratic governance, yay Syria, aiming to distance the new leadership from HTS's extremist past. However, of course, concerns persist regarding the inclusivity and intentions of this new administration. Reports have surfaced of continued sectarian violence, particularly targeting Alawite communities, despite promises of protection from the interim government. Additionally, actions such as the execution of 2 women for alleged violations of the supposedly not enforced Sharia law by HTS's military wing have raised questions about the commitment to human rights and legal reforms. While the fall of the Assad regime on December 8, 2024, was seen by many as a victory for Syria, the path forward remains uncertain. The international community watches closely as the new leadership navigates the challenges of uniting a fractured nation and addressing the grievances of its diverse population. Throughout the conflict, the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, the DAANE, commonly known as Rojava, has been recognized for its commitment to equality and inclusivity. Inspired by the principles of Öcalan, as we have discussed throughout this episode, Rojava's governance emphasizes democracy, gender equality, and the protection of minority rights, ensuring representation for various ethnic and religious groups, including Arabs, Christians, Alawites, Assyrians, and Turkmen, to name a few. The end of the civil war and the Assad regime's fall have presented both opportunities and challenges for Rojava's future. In February 2025, the world was surprised when Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned founder of the PKK, held in isolation on Emreli Island in Turkey since 1999, remember that guy? He issued a statement calling on Kurdish forces to lay down their arms. The PKK followed shortly after with a declaration of ceasefire, stating that they would only defend themselves if attacked. But here's the thing. Here's the thing that cannot be ignored. No one has seen Öcalan in years, not even proof that the voice delivering the message was actually his. The Turkish state refused to release a video of the announcement, despite its massive implications. That silence in itself speaks volumes, though, doesn't it? It's hard not to question the timing. Erdogan, Turkey's prime minister turned president, if you recall, has faced growing unrest at home, especially since jailing his primary political opponent on charges of supporting, surprise, the PKK. He has used the Kurdish threat for decades to consolidate power, so is this just another ploy? And as if on cue, there's a new call to lay down arms, not just from the supposed voice of Öcalan, but echoed by Turkey shortly thereafter on March 6, 2025. Turkey's Ministry of Defense, of course, echoed this sentiment, demanding that the PKK and its affiliates, quote, immediately and unconditionally lay down their weapons and surrender, end quote, asserting that the organization has reached the end of its lifespan. The newly appointed transitional president of Syria, a man who, until recently, was fighting under a jihadist flag, a man whose ideology, no matter how tailored his suit or polished his rhetoric, still clings to the roots of al-Nusra and HTS. Sharia law doesn't just vanish under an ideology so extreme. And when Turkey and a former jihadist find themselves in agreement on what the Kurds should do next, as in surrender their weapons, you have to wonder whose peace is being negotiated here. Between attacks from Turkey and the constant fear of not just how, but when, the new president al-Shara turns on Syria in favor of his first love of Sharia law, though he vehemently denies that he will do that, of course. Because paper constitutions and quiet ceasefires mean nothing when history has shown us that these groups only speak democracy when it's convenient and return to oppression the moment the world looks away. And why now? Why after all these years? If Öcalan truly made this call, it likely wasn't out of optimism for peace. I mean, let's be real. More likely, it was under intense pressure, possibly coercion, behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the PKK has made it clear. They won't discuss full disarmament until Öcalan is freed to lead those talks himself, a demand met so far with silence. No trust building, no guarantees, and no end to Turkish drone strikes and military campaigns in northern Syria and Iraq. It doesn't feel like a peace offering. It feels like a trap. Because to disarm now, under the illusion of diplomacy, would leave countless communities vulnerable, especially the women who've risked everything to defend Rojava, to fight off ISIS, and to build a society rooted in equality in the midst of war. The PKK's ideological reach, while controversial internationally, remains a backbone of the revolution's feminism. Abdullah Öcalan's prison writings reshaped the PKK from a Marxist-Leninist movement to one grounded in democratic confederalism and radical gender equality, placing the liberation of women at the center of liberating society itself. Now, there's a question that gets tossed around a lot. Is the PKK a terrorist group? I guess it depends on who you ask. The US and the EU say yes, but they're also supportive of Turkey. If you step into Kurdish shoes, however, you might see something different. A people long denied a homeland, banned from speaking their language, and jailed for expressing culture or thought. Is that terrorism or is it resistance? And believe me, I have tried. I've tried to understand the other side. I've tried to find logic in what Turkey is doing, in the jihadist militias, in the Assad. And I keep coming up short. What I see, however, is a pattern. Religiosity used as justification and nationalism weaponized for control. The world is shifting, and maybe it's time we stopped looking only to the centers of power for answers and started looking to the margins, to each other, all over the world, and show solidarity to one another. So if you're listening, you might be asking, what does this have to do with me? Maybe your country is also unraveling a bit. Maybe the news feels too unbearable and the wars too distant. But Rojava is proof that when people put women at the center of political, social, and military life, something special happens, something stronger and more just. A place where co-leadership is a fact of life and indisputable because the results prove its effectiveness. Where power is shared, where defense includes protecting the dignity of everyone, especially women and marginalized communities, not exploiting them. Today, the Kurdish-led administration in Rojava still houses thousands of captured ISIS fighters and their families in prison camps like Al-Hol and Roj. Many of these detainees are foreign nationals, yet most of their home countries refuse to repatriate them. This leaves Rojava bearing the burden of global indifference, guarding the remnants of a global threat without the recognition or support of a formal state, let alone the rest of the world. These prison camps are brutal, and while I'm not trying to be alarmist, it is thought that the next generation of ISIS is being trained within the walls as we speak, even more brutal than the last generation. It's also safe to say that they're a threat to the entire world. It becomes more and more difficult to police the area due to the rising tension and violence within the camps. Food has to be provided to them, and Rojava is left holding the rope. Now, if you're wondering what you can do to help, please support the Rojava Red Crescent in any way you can. It's one of the few humanitarian groups operating in the region. They provide medical care, emergency response, and critical supplies, often under direct threat. This is people like us, trying to hold the line where the world has walked away. You can even show solidarity just by participating in bringing awareness to the situation in Rojava. I will leave some links for additional ways to support. So, why lift Rojava up? Because in a world still being smothered with misogyny, where even the most progressive nations can't protect women from violence, Rojava has shown us something rare. A society that fights fascism with feminism, that stands up on the rubble of literal collapsed empires and says, we will build something better together. So what did you think about this episode about the Rojava Revolution? How did it resonate with you? Be sure to let me know in the comments, and remember, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. Thank you. If you enjoyed the show, please give a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. You can reach me with any questions or comments at greatinthesackpodcast@gmail.com.